Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Every Day is Friday 365. Today, I'm sitting down with, once again, one of my favorite guests, Anthony. If you listen to our first podcast, our first conversation, you already know how deep we go. We've talked about World War I and World War II in our first podcast, but today we'll be diving into the Korean War, the Forgotten War. I'm excited to have you on the show, Anthony.
Thanks. I'm excited to be here. And unlike my first episode where I was very formal, I decided to embrace the Every Day is Friday motif. So I've got a Hawaiian shirt on, basically.
Yeah, let's have some fun today. And I noticed
All
you
right.
brought a PowerPoint with you. And before we start with that, can for the listeners who may not be familiar with your line of work yet, can you give us a quick rundown of who you are and what you do?
Sure. For those who didn't hear from the first episode, my name is Anthony Jiovani. I am a 11-year veteran of the United States Navy. I got out of the Navy as a petty officer first class, or an E6. Um, During my time in the Navy, I traveled all around the world, and I've actually been to Busan, South Korea, which we'll talk about in this lecture today. But I enjoyed my time in the service for the most part. I decided to pursue collegiate education following my service with the post 9/11 GI Bill. I got my bachelor's from the University of South Florida, as you can see on my cup, in history. And then I also I just received my master's in law from the Regent University in Virginia Beach.
No, congratulations on all that.
Thank you. And I'm happy to be here again. I did have a lot of fun with this last time. I got some feedback about I should smile more. People said I was a little too serious, so I'm going to try to embrace that mentality, even though the topic is a little grim.
No, I really want you to dive deep into the subject, and a lot of people don't really have knowledge on the Korean War because it's called the Forgotten War. And
Mhm.
I would like to ask you the first question is what started the Korean War?
So there's actually a lot of things that lead up to the Korean War. Um, and part of it is the fact that the nation, the two nations that form, modern day North and South Korea were originally one, but were kind of always at the behest of their neighbors. Both China and Japan, like fought wars and took control of Korea, through various periods of history. And during World War II, Korea was under the occupation of the Japanese. And unlike the modern Japanese that are very pacifistic people and are some of the politest people I think I've ever met in the world, the Imperial Japanese were very brutal and they treated the Koreans very poorly. One of the things that they are most well known for of what they did in Korea is the comfort women, where they basically took Korean women from their villages and forced them into sex slavery to the Imperial Army. And when they were done with these women, they typically killed them. Uh, and so, not only do you have those kind of human rights issues and violations, but there's just a general, the Koreans they were kind of sick and tired of being dominated by their neighbors. And so when World War II ends, and like Germany's former territories are getting split up, Japan's territories are getting split up, Korea wanted to be independent, but both the United States and the Soviet Union imposed their will, and they split Korea in half along what's called the 38th parallel. And if you're looking at the screen, you can see that represented on the map there. And so this created a communist-backed North Korea and a capitalist democracy-backed South Korea, which the original plan was that after a few years that they would reunify it into one nation. However, because of rising tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States and other Western powers, that plan fell apart, and both sides quickly basically picked puppet leaders to take control of their respective side. And so I think on the next slide, well, that's the Truman Doctrine. We'll go back. But so these are the two leaders. The man on the left is Kim Il Sung, which that Kim name should sound kind of familiar because his grandson, Kim Jong-un, is the current leader of North Korea. And so that the Kim family was put into power by the Soviets. It started with Kim Il Sung and then was followed by Kim Jong-un. Or Kim Jong-il, I'm sorry. Brain fart for a second there. Kim Jong-il and then Kim Jong-un is the current member of the Kim family that's in charge. And then the pro-capitalist side of South, the United States appointed, I'm going to try to not to butcher this name, Syngman Rhee as the president of South Korea.
That's really incredible how they put two different people to control both sides. I mean, so you're saying the Chinese put the Kim in position for that, right? And then
Well,
we put this position for South Korea.
it was the Soviets, the Soviet
Okay.
Union that put Kim in, but yes, basically the United States and the other Western powers installed Syngman Rhee as the president of South Korea. And then, so there was a lot of hostility between the North and the South. The North was very it was very mountainous and mostly like farmland, and kind of that area had kind of been more impoverished. And then the South, there was a little bit more of not modern city, but like a little bit more of what we would consider cities at that time. And so, the communists always kind of appeal to like the impoverished and like the peasant farmer and the laborer in that sense. And so there was that tension there, but there's also like a slight cultural difference as well. The dialect in the North is a little bit different from the South. Uh, and so, yeah, like there's some tensions that are brewing, and it's not being helped by like the Soviets backing the North and us backing the South.
Now, Anthony, why did Korea divide into North and South in the first place?
Well, that was imposed by it was basically it was part of like the disposition of possessions following Japan's loss in World War II. And it's basically the same thing that us and the Russians did with Germany, where Germany got split in half, and Berlin also got split in half between East and West, except this was North and South. And originally there was a plan to reunify, but that completely fell apart.
And Anthony, who were the main countries involved?
So let me go back to this slide here. So officially, um, this was never a war as we would consider it, like as per like World War I, World War II, at least from the United States perspective, because there was never a formal declaration of war by Congress. In fact, the last official declaration of war by the United States Congress was following the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor in World War II.
Really?
So what this was more considered at the time, I mean, it was a war. Like all these conflicts, they're wars. But like the way that they look at it on paper, this was referred to as like a United Nations like peacekeeping mission. And so if you look at the list of belligerents here, um, for the Republic of Korea, which that's South Korea, the forces involved are, of course, the South Koreans, the United States of America, and then there were smaller groups of like troops from other UN member nations that were also sent. Like I think the French and a couple other nations sent small contingents of troops, but the majority of the fighting was done by the South Koreans and like the United States military on the South. Now, on the north side, which was the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, of course, you had the North Korean military, China, which was heavily involved, and Russia never they never claimed to involve any ground forces. In fact, Russia tried to say all they did was supply aid and guidance. But in reality, we know for a fact that Russian MiG pilots were flying sorties against like U.S. pilots, because the U.S. pilots could hear them speaking Russian to each other over the radio when they were like dogfighting.
Wow.
And if you look there too, I've got both flags. The flag on the left is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or North Korea, and then that's the flag of South Korea on the right.
It's so sad because they're fighting over land and their respective what they want to follow, and they fought one way and another, and then eventually the parallel, that's where they start, that's where they're at today still. I mean, they fought for nothing basically.
Yeah, well, if I go back to the first map, if you look at that red line there across, that's the current border. So basically, the North took a little bit of territory away from the South, and the South took a little bit of territory away from the North, and that's about it. And especially like when we go to the maps later on, like the North Koreans almost conquered all of Korea at the beginning of the war, and then the South Korean forces, backed by the U.S. military, almost conquered all of Korea, and later that year, until the Chinese got involved and pushed us back. So it's kind of crazy how much the border changed throughout the war, but then at the end, like you said, it really hasn't changed at all from the original dictation.
It changed slightly, it looks like.
Yeah,
And
very, very slightly. But it's almost, it's right there around the 30th parallel. And this line is now known as the demilitarized zone. And both the North and South station troops along this, and we also have like U.S. military troops stationed along this border to this day. Because officially, this war never ended. There was a armistice signed, which is basically an agreement to ceasefire, but the war itself, there was never like a peace resolution signed. So technically, this war continues to this day.
it's just, I'm a little bit taken away from it because so many thousands of troops were killed
Uh-huh.
in this war around my age.
Yep.
And it's a war that was forgotten, which is the sad part about it. And we're the United States is drawn to these wars to protect people and countries that need help.
Yeah. And see, that's like, if you're looking at the slide I'm showing right now, it lists the peak strength of both sides, and then at the bottom it has the casualties and losses. The largest loss was civilian death, which is estimated between 1.6 to 3 million civilians died, which they say that's more than the estimated civilian death of World War II. But then, and a lot of that, if you can see, a lot of North Koreans died, but also, let me go back. Where was it? So going back to like what leads up to this, there's kind of these two political decisions here are part of what shape the prelude to this war, which the one on the left, that's the Truman Doctrine, which prior to this conflict, the United States had been an isolationist nation, and we generally did not get involved in other people's wars unless we got attacked. We kind of stayed out of it, and that's why like we were only in World War I for the final year. We didn't get into World War II until following the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. But the Truman Doctrine kind of changed that and basically established that we would use our power projection to influence foreign policy and get involved in conflicts that didn't directly involve us, as a possible intervention, for other problems. And also, you have the National Security Act of 1947. And this act, it mandated a lot of policy and organizational changes, especially this act, number one, created the Department of Defense. Prior to that, the Department of the Navy and and the Department of the Army were their own things and didn't coordinate the best. So under this, they were reorganized as the Department of Defense. Even though they still had their own secretaries, like the Secretary of the Army, Secretary of the Navy. Another thing that this act created was the CIA, or the Central Intelligence Agency, which prior to this act had existed as the Office of Strategic Intelligence, but was reformatted into the Central Intelligence Agency that still exists today. Also, this act created the created the United States Air Force, because prior to this, the Air Force was part of the U.S. Army. It was called the U.S. Army Air Corps. And so they were split and formed into their own branch of military. But other things that kind of go along with this act is that, and this kind of goes into how did this conflict happen? Because of nuclear weapons. Because we of course had them. The Russians had started to develop them by this point. The theory was that full-scale world wars would never occur again, because the powers that had nukes would just nuke each other and the world would end. So they figured that conflicts would be on smaller scales and, more than likely wouldn't even really happen. And that's part of why this Truman Doctrine was about basically intervening into diplomatic issues around the world before they boil into like a full-on war. And because of this, theory that, everyone, people got nukes now, so they're not going to fight a normal war anymore. There was, and the restructuring of the Department of Defense, there was like a major budgeting cut that went on within the U.S. military. And a lot of military equipment was either sold off or was put into what we call mothball, or basically like storage to dry rot, because it was viewed that, we don't need all these tanks anymore. We don't need all these planes. We don't need all these ships. The conflicts aren't really going to happen like they used to anymore, which was a terrible mistake. But they say hindsight is 2020. And so, because of this decision, the forces that we had left behind in South Korea to support the South Korean military were very under-equipped and underfunded.
So did we lose a lot of our materials in this war from World War II?
Well, after the war kicked off, we actually had to go reacquire a lot of our foreign materials. Apparently, we went to Pacific battle sites and were taking burned out Sherman tanks to refurbish them because we didn't have enough tanks. And we pulled out like a lot of the stuff that had been put into storage and, basically rushed it back into service. And because we didn't have the equipment. And that's part of the reason why our forces struggled so much in the first part of the conflict, because it just didn't have what they needed.
Yeah, it seemed like the North Korean side had a lot more tanks, more troops, more air power, more airplanes than the South Koreans did, and they pushed them almost all the way to they almost won the whole thing.
Yeah. We'll go to that, but yeah, we'll go to those maps. So yeah, if you on here, the war breaks out on June 25th. That's when the North crosses the 38th parallel and invades of 1950. And by September 14th of 1950, the North had pushed, the U.S. forces and the South Korean forces all the way down to what was called the Pusan Perimeter, which is shown on that map right there. So they almost conquered the entire Korean peninsula within a few months. And like I said, a lot of this was because of the fact that like the U.S. forces didn't have the equipment and funding they needed. And on top of that, the leader of South Korea had been telling Truman that he wanted to invade North Korea. So Truman's response was to defund him and take away his military armament. So the North essentially saw that happen and then was like, cool, it's time to go.
Yeah, they took action when they needed to at
Yeah.
the right moment, and
Yeah.
they overpowered them. It seemed like.
Oh, yeah, they completely overpowered them. And it's kind of a miracle in a sense that just a few months later, we did almost the exact same thing. Because if you look at the map there on November 25th, 1950, that is when a U.S. forces, led by like a Marine, the Marines, landed in Incheon and were able to take the city of Seoul, which is the capital of South Korea, and then actually pushed the North Koreans back past the 38th parallel and, almost back to like the border with China. But in response to that, the Chinese had warned that if U.S. forces crossed the 38th parallel, they would get involved, to which our military leadership didn't believe. They were like, that's just a threat. And then they did get involved, and they began to push us back because we encountered a very heavily armed and well-supplied Chinese military.
Yeah, there's lots to this war. I mean, just the battle techniques that we used to push them back all the way to the parallel and then beyond was very, very intelligent by our generals from the U.S. Aspect of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's what's kind of interesting about this conflict too, is how many times uh the the front lines changed. And for example, the city of Seoul was conquered 3 times. We took it from the North Koreans. The Chinese then came and took it, and then we took it back from the Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
And, now the modern city of Seoul is very, like, I don't think, I've never been there to actually, so I can't speak too much on this, but I don't think you could see too much of what the effect that had on that. But at the time, the city of Seoul was basically, burned out.
Oh, I can see that completely.
Yeah.
I mean, from just war alone, from going. I mean, people, do your research, please. I mean, watch a documentary or two. It's a gruesome war.
Yeah. And then basically, after 1950 rolls around into 1951, within a couple of months, both sides come to the negotiating table to try to get to peace, but it just draws out, and the war goes into a stalemate where it's mostly skirmishes that are occurring, with the front lines changing ever so slightly. But that's how we get the result here in July 27 when the armistice is signed, and that's the border of North and South Korea that we have today. And so, yeah, if you look at it, it's crazy because the North Koreans almost took all of Korea, and then we almost took almost all of Korea, and then it kind of went back to, almost where we started. There's a slight difference in that border, but it's really not that much of a change of territory.
Now, Anthony, how did the land and weather affect the war?
So one of the, in World War II, tanks and had been and like Jeeps had been very effective in dealing with the terrain of Europe, especially in like Germany and that. In this conflict, not so much. Especially because of like the mountainous north, like tanks were very ineffective. It was very difficult for them to maneuver. And then also when the winter and, like the rainy season and winter came in and it was just mud, tanks and Jeeps just kind of got stuck in the mud. And that actually resulted in a shift from uh using like armor and vehicle movement into helicopter movement. And that's the thing is like, the helicopter came into effect at the end of World War II, but it was still too much in a prototype stage to be anywhere near useful. But in this conflict, the helicopter became a vital means of moving personnel and supplies, and especially when it came to medevac. And you've probably heard of the show MASH. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
Yeah.
So MASH, of course, it's like a comedy show, but it takes place during the Korean War. And it's actually inspired by actual MASH units, which were mobile army, I believe it's surgery. I can't remember what the H was. But it basically was like, so you had the helicopters would pick up wounded troops, and they would take these wounded soldiers to a MASH facility within an hour. They had what's called the golden hour, where like, we need to get these people to these facilities within an hour. And the part of the brainchild of the MASH system is that they weren't permanent structures. They were like tents. And so they were always on the move. They followed the front lines. And that way, they could get these people to them as soon as possible. And they said that, if they could get a wounded soldier to the MASH facility in, less than an hour, there was a high chance of his survival.
Now, Anthony, what kind of weapons were used in this war?
Um, so as I, briefly mentioned earlier, there was the fear of nuclear weapons. There was some talk of potentially using nuclear weapons, but as of this time, the only conflict that nuclear weapons have actually been used in is World War II, when we bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. But that doesn't mean that there weren't those who wanted to use them, and there was a lot of fear behind that. And apparently, the North Koreans even wanted to use them against us, and they asked the Soviets for permission to do so. And the Soviets were like, no way, you're not going to do that. But like we already talked about the helicopter and the change that brought into the conflict, which will later on be continued in Vietnam, with their usefulness there, because the land territory was kind of similar. Now you still had like naval landings and bombardments, but there really was no large scale naval battle, unlike World War II. They mostly just supported shore bombardment and landing of like Marine troops. What is probably one of the biggest technological involvements in this war specifically is the jet. Because jet technology had come out at the end of World War II, especially with like the German Messerschmitt Me-262, but they were too late in the war to really change much of anything. But in this conflict, both the Soviets and us had jet technology, which the Soviets' primary jet was the MiG-15, and ours was the F-86.
Now, did they use these planes for like dogfighting?
Yes. In fact, that's the thing is, our the one area where like we were never really challenged like effectively was our air superiority. We maintained air superiority almost the entire conflict. Now we did have dogfights, but we, you know, the North Koreans had older propeller driven Soviet supplied equipment that our jets just tore apart. And then when the MiGs showed up, uh, which a lot of the MiGs were being piloted by Russians, even though they denied involvement in this conflict. Um, the kill ratios reported are kind of debated nowadays because we claimed that we had a 10-to-1 kill ratio, and they say it was probably more like a 3 something to 1, in reality. But we basically dominated the skies.
Now, can I get your opinion on this? So, I just want to get this right. So, in the beginning of the war, when they North Korea jumped over the parallel, we didn't really go rescue, South Korea at first. We went over and we kind of protected Japan, correct? With air and ships and stuff like that, because we thought China was going to go over and no, we're going to go over and we protected Taiwan. Actually, my bad.
Yeah. Well, so yes, there had been prior to this, conflict starting, um, the in China you had the two major factions, because there's many factions that were like fighting each other in China during World War II, that they briefly put that conflict on hold to fight the Japanese. But the two primary factions were the Chinese communists led by Mao Zedong, and then the nationalists, which were the Kuomintang, and I can't remember their leader's name right now, but basically after World War II ends, the communists resume the conflict in China, the Civil War, and they beat the nationalist army, because the nationalist army had done most of the fighting against the Japanese. The communists had kind of gone to the mountains and hid, and let them take the brunt of that. And so that army was pretty beaten and fatigued, and they went in and pushed them, and the leadership fled the mainland and reestablished their government in Taiwan. And now we at that time recognized Taiwan as the legitimate government of China, and they referred to themselves, and they still do to this day, as the Republic of China. But internationally, that is not recognized by most nations, and like even we don't anymore, and that's why they're now called Taiwan. The island itself, Taiwan, is its proper name, but the government there, uh, we refer to as the Taiwans, as opposed to the Republic of China, as they call themselves. But that's the remainder. That was founded by the remainder of the nationalist army that fled. And prior to this, the Chinese, like the communist Chinese, were very upset that we were recognizing Taiwan as like the true China. And so there was a lot of worry that they were going to take this opportunity to invade. And that's actually something that we still deal with to this day in this area, is the fact that, communist China still claims Taiwan and says that they're going to reunify it, whether by diplomatic or by force. And so by treaty, we are supposed to come and protect Taiwan should the Chinese try to invade, well, the communist Chinese. But it's, it's one of those things where like you can see where a lot of these problems started and they've never resolved.
Yeah. No, completely.
There's still issues.
Now, if I could circle back, I mean, can I get your opinion? I mean, how did President Truman handle the war in North Korea?
So initially, Truman was very supportive of the general who was in charge at that time, which was Douglas MacArthur, who was commander of I believe it was the East. They called it like the Eastern Forces, because he MacArthur, post-World War II, had been installed as basically the military governor of Japan, and he was responsible for basically the disarmament and rebuilding of Japan post-World War II. And so when this conflict kicked off, he was headquartered out of Japan in that, and so he was coordinating a lot of this from Japan. He did have some supporters on the ground. But then as the war went on, Truman began to become very worried of MacArthur's handling of the war, especially because, MacArthur basically made a comment about how the nuclear option is always on the table. And after the after the Chinese got involved and kind of decimated our forces that had gone north, that's when Truman basically fired MacArthur, which MacArthur, after getting fired, appeared before Congress and made a very famous speech that is, old soldiers never die, they just fade away. And now MacArthur, even though he's, was kind of controversial even back then, was very well liked by a lot of the American populace. And so Truman's firing of him did not sit well with the American public. And because of that, Truman did not seek re-election. And so the next U.S. president was Dwight Eisenhower, who was also a former general during World War II.
And what I know is that he ran on that he ended the war. He was running on that.
Yeah. And so, they say hindsight's 20/20, but, Truman did what he kind of thought was the right thing to do, prior to this conflict, and who's to say what would have happened had he made some other decisions. Alternative history theories are fun because it's kind of like, what would have happened if this happened or this didn't happen? But it's really hard to tell at the end of the day, because it's like, well, maybe the North wouldn't have invaded had Truman, not defunded the South Korean military. But you never know. They might have just waited. And that, because both sides were itching for conflict.
Yeah, it seems like it. What was the biggest takeaway for you on the Korean War?
So the Korean War, one of the things that I think I like the fact that it's referred to as the Forgotten War, because it kind of is. I mean, in our U.S. history classes, they do teach a lot of World War II, and they teach Vietnam, World War II because it's our last huge success, so to speak, in Vietnam because of how controversial and messed up everything kind of went. But this is the first battle, in a sense, of the Cold War, and it's almost maybe not even mentioned. I mean, the conflict was short for the most part. The main intense fighting was only about a year to a year and a half, and then it kind of stalled out. But I mean, technically the war went on for over 3 years, and as we talked before, it never really ended. And from time to time, the North and the South do still shoot at each other to this day, but it's just little skirmishes. And there hasn't been full-on battles since this armistice was signed. But a lot of North Koreans from time to time do defect to the South. In fact, a few years ago, there was a famous one where a North Korean border guard, dropped his rifle and ran across, and as he was running across, the other North Koreans shot him multiple times. And he made it into the South, and they took him to the hospital, And the doctor said that if we are able to get all the lead out of this man and he lives, we're worried that the parasites will kill him. Because like the North Koreans nowadays, for the most part, are very malnourished, and there's a lot of like parasites in their food, because of like basically unsanitary farm practices that they've been forced into from not being able to purchase like legitimate fertilizer. They're basically using human feces to fertilize their crops, uh, which, will carry parasites and other things into their bodies. And, um, really the only North Koreans that have it good per se are the party officials and like those living in Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea. In fact, there's a very famous North Korean defector by the name of Yomi Park, who's done a lot of interviews in that, and she basically tells her story of how she escaped North Korea, um, and for a time was even kind of sold into sex slavery, uh, because they escaped through China, and then was able to escape that, and now lives I believe she lives in the United States now. But she's done a lot. She's written books, and she's done a lot of like talks about how bad things are in the North and how desperate a lot of the people are to run. Because she said that we knew things weren't like we knew the propaganda was false because we could actually see into China. And the North Korean propaganda will teach their people that the world is essentially destroyed and North Korea is a paradise. But, they're looking over into China, which, yeah, China has a lot of human rights issues and other things going on, but they're seeing like industry and like people driving cars and all these other things because they literally lived like on the side of the river that borders that I think it's that river right there, the Eula River on the map. Um, and so she was like, we knew it was a lie because we could see across the border, and we could also see at night because they have electricity. Because that's the thing is, if you look at satellite images of like when they post those images of like satellites going across the world and they show all the lights, the only part of North Korea that's lit up at night is Pyongyang, which is the capital. The rest of North Korea is in the dark.
It almost seems like the Korean War. Well, it's the forgotten war, but it's the never-ending war. It seems like.
Yeah. Because yeah, like you said, is officially a ceasefire was signed, but a peace negotiation was never formally ratified or recognized. So technically, it's still going, and that's the way the North sees it. The North, teaches their children that, that Americans are going to kill them unless they fight, and that their only salvation is their faith in the Kim family. And that's the thing is like the Kim dynasty has essentially created a cult of personality where they're almost venerated as like gods.
No, yeah, they're trying to leave a legacy on a whole nation.
Yeah. Um, and one of the funniest things is you look at these pictures of like the North Korean farmers and they're like skin and bones. And then you look at like Kim Jong-un and his like lackeys, and they're all like pushing 300 pounds. Like it's so blatantly obvious how backwards everything is. But that's the thing is, North Korea is a communist dictatorship. And if you question the government or the Kim family, you're put to death publicly. So there is, like they don't have any freedom. We have people in this country who, if they can't get a candy bar that they want, they're having a meltdown. And you got people in North Korea who they don't even know what a candy bar is. At least not in what we would think of. And there's a lot of videos of like North Korean defectors that are like living in the South now, and they'll be like shown Western like snacks and other things, and they're like, you guys just eat this whenever you want. It's so foreign to them.
Yeah, what they don't know, they don't know what a candy bar is. They won't know what a good life is if they can't see the outside world. Do you have
What else?
anything else you want to share in the PowerPoint?
Let me look. So there's the first slide. Talked about that. We talked about that. We talked about that. We talked about that. So here's a quick rundown of key events. From 1910 to 1945, Korea is under Japanese occupation. 1945, Korea becomes divided amongst the 30th parallel. 1948, both of the Koreas established their respective governments. June 25th, 1950, the North invades. June 27th, 1950, the UN Security Council condemns North Korea. June 30th, 1950, Truman orders U.S. ground forces to Korea. September 15th, 1950, the Incheon landing occurs, which is where we were able to come up behind the North Koreans and cut them off. October 1950, China enters the war, supporting the North Koreans. July 10th, 1951, the truce talks begin in Kaesong, but like I said, they last like 18 months. And then, of course, the war ending. And there's a picture of some supply vehicles like coming across the 38th parallel. Here are what I would say are the key battles of north of the Korean War, which of course the Battle of Incheon, the invasion of the North by UN forces, the Chinese intervention, and then the last like key battle is the Battle of the Choson Reservoir, which is where a bunch of U.S. forces essentially got trapped behind enemy lines in this part of North Korea during the winter that was called the Choson Reservoir, because there's a giant lake that like froze over, and they were able to like hold that position while being surrounded.
No, it's a battle that was back and forth.
Yeah. Yeah. Here, let me. Oh, there we go. Ah. Here, let me stop sharing my screen because now we're going into craziness. Stop sharing. There we go.
Yeah, how
Creating.
did the Korean War shape the Cold
Oh,
War
sorry.
after?
So basically, you've got technologies that are being understood now, like jet technology is now the primary. Fighters are all jets now. Now, like, we're still using propeller-driven aircraft for like bombing missions, especially Vought Corsairs, which came out like in the mid to late part of World War II, were very effective as close air support for the Marines because they have this gull wing design, like their wings kind of come off the plane and swoop down and up, which allowed them to have, like, to the left and right, they had like increased field of view. And because they weren't as fast as a jet, they could fly low and slow, and then they had rocket pods attached, and they would shoot the rockets at like enemy forces and positions. In fact, my grandfather, Grandpa Jiovani, he was in the last year of Korean War in the U.S. Marine Corps, and his job was that he was a refueler on board a U.S. aircraft carrier, and he would refuel Corsairs that were going on patrol. And so he was lucky enough that he never saw direct combat, but he was in that final year of the conflict. And other things that changed is So like this is like we talked about the helicopter and how important the helicopter became, especially like in Vietnam, the helicopter is even more important. And this is also what led to the creation of like the helicopter gunships, like the Apache and some of these other ones, because like they saw how effective these helicopters could be in this terrain that wasn't conducive to tanks. So they're like, well, let's make a helicopter with a bunch of missiles and heavy machine guns strapped onto it. Um, Advances in medicine, especially with like the whole MASH system, which, that whole concept was carried on into the Vietnam War. Um, Probably one of the biggest societal changes was the desegregation of the armed forces. Now, that wasn't official in in the Korean War, but it kind of happened out of necessity because you had all these units that were getting blown to pieces. You had stragglers all over the place. And so people just started to join together and fight. And they didn't care if you were white or black or whatever. It was like, hey, we're here to do a mission together and we need to live. And so you start to see pictures of, white troops and black troops fighting together, you know, drinking together, something that in World War II was completely off the books. It's like, no, that doesn't happen. Um, you know, and so, of course, by the time Vietnam rolls around, the military had been completely desegregated. But that was a big deal for the Korean conflict, especially since it wasn't like official; it was just a practicality.
What surprised me about the war was how many nations were involved.
Yeah. Well, see, that's why some people say, even though it was never officially declared a war by U.S. Congress, and it, it's like this UN peacekeeping mission. I mean, if you look at the amount of fighting and like the amount of nations involved, it's essentially a small scale world war.
Yeah.
But they don't really refer to it as that. Um, and like we said, the conflict still continues today.
Now, Anthony, why is the Korean War called the Forgotten War?
Mostly because it's overshadowed by World War II and the Vietnam War. And, like World War II is focused on so much because it's like our last major like victory. And not only that, but it also changes global politics, because the United Nations is formed right after World War II and creates what they call the liberal world order, which is basically the world we live in today is a byproduct of World War II. And so that's part of why it's focused on so much, because it's like, yeah, we won, we did such a great job, and we created this this world economic order, which, that's why they kind of jokingly referred to us as like Team America and that, because they're like, yeah, the world police, like we go around and solve everybody else's problems, because that's essentially what we're expected to do as part of this like whole United Nations concept. And that's even why in this conflict they're like the UN peacekeeping forces. But and then the Vietnam War, because like it's such a quagmire. It is just, you know, it's very similar with like territorial exchanges, with how like, people were taking one hill one day, the next day they were leaving it, the next day they were taking it back, and going back and forth. Um the continuation of this whole capitalism versus communism debate, the involvement of other nations without like really officially being there, and this, it's a proxy war. It's used by like the Soviets and the communist Chinese to essentially tire the United States and the UN out, because they're like, oh, if we can tire these people out, then we can essentially impose our will. And then, of course, the Vietnam War completely falls apart and, you know, results in the fall of Saigon. and our like retreat to the point where now, there isn't a North and South Vietnam. There's just communist Vietnam. They won. And, and of course, then the veterans coming back from that era were treated very badly. And I'm not going to say that there wasn't atrocities committed. There's always atrocities committed in war. But the press, and especially like Hollywood actresses like Jane Fonda was very infamous as being referred to as Hanoi Jane, because she actually went to Hanoi where a lot of U.S. soldiers are being kept as prisoners of war and demonized us and was like, you're a bunch of baby killers. You're da 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 da. And so to this day, like Vietnam vets, they hate her, can't stand her. And, so a lot of guys from Vietnam came back and they weren't really received that well. And, they deal with that. Those of them that are still around, they still deal with that to an extent.
So, Anthony, after World War II, a lot of nations formed the United Nations. What's the main point of having the United Nations?
So the main goal was to effectively create policy to increase human rights, to basically protect smaller nations that couldn't really protect themselves. And the ultimate goal was to try to prevent the major nations from fighting another war. Like that, we'll come to the peace table, we'll talk, and that way we won't fight another war. But I mean, clearly that hasn't worked.
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, you've had the Vietnam War, you've had these smaller like conflicts that a lot of people don't even really know about. Like, you had the first Gulf War in the early '90s, but then you had like the Bosnian conflict we were involved in. Most people are like, "What's that?" You had these other small scale like things that were occurring, and then of course, you had the war on terror, which I'm a veteran of that. I was on ships that were participating in both, our Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. And, that was the 3.5 years that I was stationed aboard USS Nimitz, an aircraft carrier. That was my primary purpose, was to participate in those conflicts. Now, I didn't do it directly in combat. I was an air traffic controller, but I helped send pilots on their missions and help them come back and land on the ship. So I was lucky enough that I didn't really see direct conflict in that way. But then later on, I was on USS Ponce in 2016, and, we're operating in the Red Sea, and the Houthi rebels in Yemen shot missiles at us. And so, my unit was awarded the combat action ribbon. So all of us got to consider ourselves combat vets and wear that on our, as part of our like medals and ribbons. But no one really talked about that when that happened. And now you're hearing about it every day because the Houthis are still shooting at us in the Red Sea. And, they're backed by Iran. And that was another thing, the whole Iran conflict that almost happened in the 70s because of, the disposition of the Shah by the, Ayatollah, the Ayatollah Khomeini, this Islamic religious fundamentalist, and, using the college kids to create an Islamic revolution and take over. And they took over the U.S. Embassy and held tons of Americans hostage. We almost went to war with them for that. I mean, there's been a lot of I get the idea of trying to keep peace and prevent war. But honestly, war is inevitable. It's if you look at history, it's a part of being human. Like, all cultures have participated in it. All, like, it is not, it's, whether it's, small scale, like skirmish, to a world war, like, it's part of human nature. And like now, of course, we've got like the Ukraine conflict going on. We've got the conflict in Gaza. You know, the UN's supposed to prevent these things from happening, but, talk is cheap.
Yeah, I've heard that the definition of war is two sides fighting over the same thing.
Yeah, I remember you brought that up in the previous one, and you know, I agree with that. But as like a member of the military, I'd say probably the best definition I've ever heard is war is hell. And that's the thing about war is like you do your best to limit civilian casualties, but they always happen. And, clearly like the Korean conflict's a perfect example of that. Like look at all the civilians that died. Or like look at what's going on in uh, you know, with this whole Ukraine conflict. You've got cities being bombed and Ukraine at this point is kind of decimated. Uh, and it just it's sad. It really is.
It's
Oh,
sad at the end of the day, though, with the formation of the United Nations, it seems like a lot of the that becomes the problem. I mean, do you think all these wars could have been avoided?
well, like I said before, with like alternate history theories, it's difficult to say. But at the end of the day, war is inevitable. Conflict is inevitable. I mean, a perfect example is I can go on Facebook right now and I could put up a picture of a stone and I'll say, oh, that's a boulder. And someone else will be like, no, it's a pebble. And they'll get into an argument over something so trivial. So like, who cares? It's just a rock, but like, that's the thing is like these conflicts, they start generally as something trivial. You know, you're North Korean, I'm South Korean. You talk slightly different than I do. You're a poor farmer, I live in a city. But these tensions build. And then, you have political ideologies come in and they say, hey, see those guys over there that live in the cities? They hate you. And I'll help you. I'll give you power. All you got to do is help me join the revolution and work towards the utopia. Well, if people had paid attention to the Communist Manifesto written by Karl Marx, the utopia is only achievable once everything else has been destroyed.
I just can't get over how many people have died in war. That just like a conflict like just the Korean War, like not much changed after we were done with it.
No,
Thousands of men have died, and women
that's,
over there too,
yeah, and children, you
children too.
know, and that's the thing is like, it's, like I said, war is inevitable. It's the dark side of humanity that we don't really want to acknowledge is there, but if you study history, it's there. It's always been there. It's never going to go away. Like they said that after World War I, they're like, oh, this war was so brutal that nobody will ever want to fight a war again. No. Or like, in the Cold War, the theory of mutually assured destruction that, we've got nukes, the Russians got nukes, these other people got nukes. Like, we won't fight a war because everyone will just nuke each other. And then the world, but has that stopped? Like, yeah, people haven't nuked anybody, but, it hasn't stopped the threat of nuclear war, because even Putin and them have said, oh, we could potentially use nuclear weapons. And, war doesn't just go away. Um, And sometimes it's a necessary evil. Sometimes it's just, there's no escaping it, and you have to do it. Like a good example would be World War II. We could have said, the Japanese hit us, and it really wasn't that big a deal. We lost some ships, but we refloated most of them. So and they didn't get the carriers, so we could just, but they're like, no, we need to end this, or Germany, with the Nazis. Like, the Nazis were going on a steamroll throughout Europe. And yeah, like if we hadn't gotten involved, like, yeah, they made some tactical decisions that were screwing them over, but like, we had not gotten involved, how much longer would that conflict have gone on? Like, it just, I think one of the sad things is that war is something that it's part of human nature. It's a dark part of human nature. We don't like to acknowledge it. But the liberal world order, since World War II, has tried to pacify us and try to say, oh, aggression and these things are not good. You don't want to act this way. And that's done really nothing but, weaken nations who've taken that to heart and embolden nations who don't care. Like Russia or China. They're like, no, we're preparing our people for war. And my biggest fear in question is, are we ready for the next one? And when does that happen? Because some people say we're already in it. It just hasn't officially been declared yet.
That's a great takeaway. And with that being said, I mean, why don't schools teach more about war?
It's an unpleasant topic. And it's something that if you look at like the current trends of education, they focus more on you've got kind of the two sides. You've got, let's focus on the STEM fields, mathematics, science, engineering. Let's focus on those things. And then you've got the emotional intelligence side. They're like, oh, like, let's just teach people that it's wrong to harm others and everyone should be respected. And I'm not saying that's not true, but you got to teach the good with the bad. And you can't just pretend like these bad things never happened, because that's what causes people to become complacent. And then when the bad things come back, they're like, how could this have happened? We taught people weren't like this. If you've ever seen the movie Fury with Brad Pitt about, there's tanks, there's a scene that I really like this line, where after they take this town, they go into the mayor's office, and all the Nazis in there have killed themselves. And the kid's like, why are you showing this to me? And he's basically telling him, ideals are peaceful. History is violent. And that's the truth.
Now, with you studying the Korean War, what surprised you the most while studying this war?
I think the biggest thing is how there are a lot of things I learned about this that I was like, maybe I was taught this once when I was young, but I don't really remember focusing on this conflict. Like, I remember you had in like the history textbooks when I was in school, which I have no idea what textbooks are like nowadays in the public education system, but we had like whole chapters devoted to like World War II and Vietnam. And I think we maybe got a page to the Korean War. And is that really enough for that conflict? And that's, like I said, they focus on World War II because it's our last hurrah. They focus on Vietnam because of how much of a disaster it was. And then they got this, and they're like, Now, I was talking with my best friend earlier today, and he's from a town in Alabama that has a lot of Korean immigrants and Korean American descendants. And he was telling me about how, like, in that town, they talked about the Korean War a lot because a lot of them had been in it, had lived through it, and had fled. And so for them, it's a big deal. And I'm sure, if you talk to any South Korean, you know, living in the United States, or, a North Korean, even like a North Korean defector, they'd still talk about this and be like, yeah, it's a big deal. Now, of course, like, the North probably told their people that they pretty much won, even though no one really won. The territory really didn't change. But that was probably the mindset. It was like, we won the conflict. And, like I said, they teach their people that the rest of the world essentially is destroyed, and North Korea is like all that remains. Except for the evil Americans who will come and they'll kill you.
Yeah, what I've learned is history is only written by the victors,
Yes. This
and
is a fact.
yeah, it's really impactful. Uh, what does the Korean War teach us about peace and conflict?
Um, I would say one of the biggest lessons from the Korean War that should have been learned, which really hasn't, is that just because a previous conflict has ended, it doesn't mean you disarm. Because that's what leads to this, is like the disarmament. And then the fact that, like, our troops are so unprepared, underfunded, untrained, that they're just being annihilated. And that's the one reason why the Marines did as good as they did, because the Marines basically refused to let go of their equipment and refused to, like, cut their training. They were like, no, we're Marines. we don't do that. But the Army and the Navy were pretty much defunded. Like, when the war first broke out, Truman's like, let's use the Navy to blockade, and if necessary, do shore bombardments. And they pretty much told him, we don't really have the ships to do that anymore. Because most of them have been mothballed. And so, yeah, I would say that's the biggest thing anyone could learn from this conflict, is it's unpopular because, yeah, like, a lot of money gets spent on military. And that's always a debate, is how much should we spend on the military? And why are we spending so much on the military? We could be using that to build schools. We could be using that to do this or do that. Well, okay, I'll listen to that argument. But at the same time, like, you got to have a funded military and a well-trained military, because you never know when the next conflict is on the horizon.
Yes, because as you were saying, North Korea is always fighting South Korea to this day.
Yeah.
And I mean, I would be terrified to be in South Korea because you never know.
Right. Well, nowadays, the North Korean military is, I don't really have any other way to say it, they're kind of a joke nowadays, because they were pretty much propped up by the Soviets. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, they lost all that support. And so a lot of what they have military-wise, like equipment, is mostly old Soviet tech. But, a tank's a tank. Like, yeah, maybe it's not a good tank, but it's still a tank. And, it's one of those things where, well, I mean, even like the current conflict in Ukraine, like, the Russians are using, like, most of their modern military equipment's been destroyed, and they've gone back to using Soviet tanks and, like, bolt-action rifles. And they're still fighting.
Now, Anthony, I got this question for you. I've been waiting to ask you. What would you say
Yes.
to someone who didn't know the Korean War happened?
Well, so the first thing I would say to anybody who's curious about these topics is don't just take what I say for like, don't just take what I say and be like, yeah, I'm going to believe 100% of what he says. I'm a person. I make mistakes. I don't remember things right sometimes, like all of us. Now, I did research this before we talked about it, and I'm sure there's something I've still missed, and maybe people will be like, oh, he forgot to talk about this, blah, blah, blah. But like, the best thing you can do, and not just with war, but like any topic, do your own research. Don't just take this person or this person's words and be like, yeah, okay, you know, and I think if that's one major failing of our modern educational system, in my opinion, is that the modern system does not teach you how to think. It teaches you what to think. And that's the thing, is if they don't teach you about this stuff, and you don't find out about it till you talk to someone like me, or you're flipping through the TV channels and a documentary comes on, or you're at the library and you pick up a book and you're like, what's the Korean War? I've never heard of that. And this is why I'm so passionate about history and why it's something that needs to be taught. And because, yeah, it isn't a pleasant topic. It's mostly about death and destruction, but it's
Yes.
a part of how politics functions. So if you're going to understand politics, you need to understand how war plays into that. And the hope of learning about these things too is to hopefully prevent them from happening again.
No, yeah, you're
You know,
right.
they
Learn
like,
from the past.
there's an old saying, history repeats itself. That's not 100% accurate. But it does rhyme a lot.
Now, Anthony, what's a story from the Korean War that really moved you?
So this is something I was going to bring up, didn't talk about it. Let me see if I've still got the file open on my phone. But one of the things that really moved me was the the American POWs that were brutalized. And yeah, there it is. And there's a man, his name is Emile Capon, I believe you say it's Kapaun. And he was a chaplain in the Marine Corps. And he was actually he was in the Army, I'm sorry, but he was a Catholic chaplain. And he became a POW, and he was brutalized, and he was tortured, and he died. But while he was a POW, and a lot of the POWs on our side died in the Chinese camps, because they were covered in disease, like dysentery was a bad one they dealt with. They were malnourished, they were beaten and tortured. But while he was captured, he continued to provide like morale support to these other people. He like did what he could to sneak medicine to some of the other sick troops. And later, he eventually died while in captivity. But because of what he did, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. And, there's so many stories of just like, it's hard to focus on individual soldiers unless we have some form of record that, details their deeds. Like, if you won the Medal of Honor, yeah, there's going to be a record of what you've done to earn that medal. And so we know about those people. But, as someone who's a veteran myself, like, most of us don't know much about the everyday soldier or sailor or Marine, airman, and what they have to go through, the way they live. their dreams. Because a lot of people seem to look at them and they're like, oh, they're military, whatever. But it's like, well, they're a person just like me and you. They have dreams and aspirations. You know, uh, how many of these guys were like, oh, I'm just going to do a couple years and I'm going to go use the GI Bill, get an education. And they died in a prison camp, starving to death. I mean, and this past week was Memorial Day. And yeah, like a lot of people, and I'm not condemning this, don't get me wrong. A lot of people like to go out and they barbecue and they have a great old time, and that's fine. But people have kind of forgotten that the true purpose of Memorial Day is to remember the fallen, to remember those who didn't come back. And how many of these guys would have loved to have been at a barbecue that day?
Now, Anthony, can you dive into what the forgotten soldier is?
You mean like the unknown soldier?
Unknown soldier.
Yeah, that's right. So basically, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier is a monument erected to, I believe it was a guy from the Civil War who very little remained of his body, couldn't be identified. And so a special monument was erected to remember him. Because like, well, we can't remember his name. I have no idea who he was, but we can at least remember that he was someone who fought and died for his country. And so, yeah, if you ever go to Arlington, they do a changing of the guard. I believe it's every 30 minutes to an hour. And it's a very touching ceremony, and they demand that everyone is quiet when you're there. And yeah, they pay respects. And, I mean, it's now with modern DNA technology, maybe they could figure out who this guy is, but you got to first figure out, like, try to find a living relative, because they can maybe sample what remains of his DNA if anything does, but you got to hope that there's a living relative who did like a 23andMe or an Ancestry, and they can get that.
Yeah, and I'm always taken away by how many men have served and died overseas.
Yeah.
With that being said, I want to ask you this one: how can we best honor veterans today?
So, the best way I would say it is, don't forget us. Remember that we were people too, that we have, we had our own hopes and our dreams. That, yeah, people might not agree with us for going off to war or, why we did it, but we volunteered, because that's the thing, the draft hasn't happened since Vietnam. We volunteered and we sacrificed and we gave up a lot. I mean, there are things that the everyday person takes for granted that, like, even on a ship, like when I was on the aircraft carrier, there were times when I couldn't even take a shower because the water condenser broke down. And so, like, oh, shower secured. And you're just like, I feel gross right now. It would just be so nice just to take a shower. Or, like other times where, one of the Ponce, the ship I was on, they had to do maintenance on it where they had to cut off the ventilation. And so while we were on duty, you can't leave the ship. You got to stay on the ship for 24 hours when you're on duty. So when we were on duty, they would turn the ventilation off at night. You're laying in your rack and you're just like cooking because you're inside a big metal can, with no airflow. And, don't get me wrong, like the guys in the desert, they go through a lot worse than what I had to deal with. But like, there are things that we still wished that we could have had, or time we could have spent with family, that we had to give up. Like there are a lot, like Christmas, Thanksgiving, some of these times where it's like, man, my family, they're probably, you know, they're probably sitting around eating turkey right now. And I'm eating turkey on the ship. They flew us some turkeys in and that to eat on the ship, but I'm like eating it in this metal tray, and wishing I was someplace else. Now I chose that life, I'm not going to bash anybody for that. Like I chose that life and I did it for 11 years. And a lot of other veterans, like my best friend's still in, he's actually getting close to retirement. He's got a little less than 2 years before he retires. It's, and, but he barely gets to see his kids, and I mean, it just, that's the one thing that's sad is that because the conflicts have generally been all overseas and not close to our nation, no one really sees the direct effect unless they're out there. And, 9/11 happened and I watched that on live television when I was in 9th grade. And man, it was sad. It was brutal. And it was a main factor of me wanting to go do something to stop something like that from happening again. And it wasn't about politics back then. It was just, we got attacked. I watched people jump out of a burning building because they'd rather pancake than burn to death on live television. And I was just angry. I just wanted to do something about it. And so I get it when a lot of younger people, like, they're angry and they want to do something. But think a little bit more about what you're going to do before you do it. And violence should never be the first answer. There's other ways. There's better ways.
Yeah, and a lot of people, I've learned that I always thank people for their service because you never know what's behind those eyes.
Yeah. I'll be honest. When people say that to me, I don't really know how to respond to that. Like I can go, oh, thanks. But like, it's kind of strange to hear, honestly. It's like, well, and sometimes you're like, do they mean it? Or are they just saying it? And yeah, like, as veterans, our healthcare system's pretty terrible. That could definitely use some improvements. It's better than what it used to be. It still has a long way to go. And, probably one of the best benefits I had post-service was the GI Bill, being able to go to college, and not really get into college debt. That was really good. And some people kind of criticized me and were like, oh, you got your college paid for free. I'm like, it wasn't for free, man. Like I gave up 11 years of my life for that.
What was your biggest takeaway from being in the service for 11 years?
It's hard to narrow it down to one thing, but, I met my best friend in the service. So, you know, we still talk. Like I just talked to him this morning. And, we talk like once or twice a week at minimum. Uh, and, I got to see the world. Like, and that's the thing is like, a lot of people nowadays, they travel, but they don't go to the kind of places I've been to. Because a lot of the places that we go, yeah, we might go to Japan and Korea and these other places that are more developed, but we still go to like the parts that they don't really want you to see. They drop us off in very seedy areas to where you're like, I don't think I should be here right now. I think I should get moving. You know, uh, or like even in, I'll never forget, when we were in the United Arab Emirates in the port of Jebel Ali. We're in a port. It's industrial. And, the United Arab Emirates, I don't know how much you know about it, but they basically, once they found out they had oil, they just, they went on a spending spurge and they've built entire cities out of the desert, and they're green because they spend a fortune on like water. Um, they have the world's tallest structure, the Jebel Ali. Uh, but so you've got this place that is hailed as being like one of the jewels of the world, and how like, oh, look at how developed, and they got a mall with a ski slope inside of it and all these other things. And but like the part where we go, drop us off in the port, get on the tour bus, and you get to see where like the shipyard guys live. They're living in buildings that don't have windows. Like, I mean, the windows were there once, but they're busted and long gone and haven't been replaced. You're almost like, man, this looks like a war zone. That's where they live. But that's all kept out of sight.
Yeah, I wish more people understood how lucky they are to be living in America.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's, that was one of the biggest things I learned about going into the service is like, we have problems in our country. What country doesn't have problems? But our problems, like the kinds that we're dealing with for the most part, are minuscule compared to what most other nations are dealing with around the world. And you don't really see that, and you don't really understand that unless you go and you see it firsthand.
And Anthony, this is the part of the show I want to try transition to the Friday mindset part of the show. I want to dig into your journey, your mindset, and the moments that shaped you. Um, what's one of the biggest truths about life you wish more people understood?
That it's fragile. It's a lot more fragile than we take for granted. And that there's good times, there's bad times. Take the good with the bad and really cherish the good moments. And don't like really cherish the time you spend with your family and your loved ones. And when you're healthy, cherish your health, and all these other things, because you never know when all that can go away.
And I want that's really powerful. And for someone struggling with their confidence out there, what should they do?
Well, I mean, they need to do a deep soul search for themselves, and they need to find the things that they're good at. And they really need to focus on those things and be like, you know what? I might not be the best basketball player, but man, do I like studying history, and I can do, and I can talk to people about this. Or I might not be, a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, but man, do I, I like to write, I can write these stories. And it's not really about being rich and famous. Like, there's always going to be someone who's got more money than you. There's always going to be someone who's better known than you are. And that's, unfortunately, I think that's like a big problem that we're facing as a society nowadays because of social media, is that people chase illusions. They see someone post something on social media about, I'm living my best life over here, and they're like, oh, I want that too. Yeah, who wouldn't want that? But, you know, behind the scenes, they don't see that it's like a 5-second photo, 5-second video being made in front of a fountain, and then they're getting told, get out of here, move on. Or that, like, they might act like they have the best relationship with their spouse, but behind the scenes, they're just constantly arguing. But they don't show that on social media. They'll show the good side. And, so really don't chase the illusion. Instead focus on what you can do. Like, how can I be the best version of me? And it doesn't take a lot. Sometimes the best thing you can do for somebody is to show them a kindness. Like, even if it's something as simple as, like, you see someone carrying a heavy load and they're coming toward the door, and you just hold it open for them. Like, you don't know what that might have done for that person that day.
Yeah, you never know. And I love to tell people is take action. Figure out what you want and ignore the opinions of others.
Yeah, well, because there's always going to be people who say, you can't do that. And I'll tell you right now, pretty much the whole time I was in the service, I had certain leaders who would tell me, you don't belong here. We're going to wash you out. You're not going to make petty officer. You're not going to be this. And I said, no, sorry. You're not getting rid of me that easy. And yeah, I'm not going to say I was the best sailor. I definitely had my faults. But, I did it for 11 years. I fulfilled my contract. I got my honorable discharge. And those naysayers, like, they're not a part of my life anymore. And I've gone on and done other things since I've left the service. And, but I take the good with the bad. And I try to say, how can I be the best version of myself and learn from the mistakes of myself and others? And part of what I always want to do, especially, like, I worked at this comic shop while I was doing college a couple of years ago. And one of the guys I was working with there, I became pretty close with. And I did my best to teach him how to, learn from my mistakes. Because he's a young guy. He's like 21. I'm in my late 30s, and I'm like, hey, man, instead of doing that, do it this way. Be easier. And I didn't do it in a way where I'm like, what are you doing, you idiot? You don't do that. No. Hey, man, let me show you something.
Yeah, that's a great takeaway because you got to learn from the mistakes you've made. And, I've given the secret sauce away from my failures for someone else's success, at the end of the day. And it's powerful. I recommend anyone out there is go after the difficult things and chase after that failure because you'll learn from that failure more than actually winning.
Failure is a better teacher than success. You'll learn more from your mistakes than you do from succeeding.
Yeah, I believe the best thing someone can develop is the quality of being unstoppable and never giving up.
Yeah, tenacity. That's because there's always going to be a challenge. There's always going to be the next bill, the mortgage payment, you just had your first child and now you got to pay for all what comes around with that. Now your kid's 16 years old and they want a car. Like there's always going to be a struggle or a challenge that's going to arise. But the true measure is, well, how do you face it? Yeah, you're going to screw up. People, we make mistakes all the time, but do you learn from it? And you know what? I did that last time. That didn't work. Let's try that. Let's do it this time now.
I love to say, uh, I love to say, like, you never know if you never take the jump into the water, if you'll never know if you'll sink or swim.
Well, I mean, that's everything comes with a risk. And a lot of the best things in life involve a lot of risk. And I'm not saying be stupid and, be suicidal, where you're like, I'm going to go jump off this building and see if I live. No, that's not a good risk. But you know what is a good risk? Is, walking through a park and you see a woman and she smiles at you. I'm going to go talk to her. Or I can just keep going. Or you hear about a job opportunity and you're like, I don't know if I, fully qualify for that, but like, maybe I should put in for it anyways. Yeah, there's those things I just mentioned. You'd go horribly wrong. A girl could tell you to kick rocks. That job could be like, yeah, I don't understand why you applied for this. But if you don't take that risk, you don't know what could have happened.
It's that taking action part of life.
Yeah. And there'll be pain. There'll be
oh
times
yeah,
where it ain't going to work.
but you learn from that.
Yeah, you learn from it. Not
And
saying it ain't going to hurt. You might think about it from time to time. But you're like, what did I learn from this? How do I move forward?
how do I grow the most from the situation?
Yeah.
And the show is called Every Day is Friday, and Friday has a special energy, whether it's freedom, excitement, or just feeling of accomplishment after a long week. Anthony, I want to hear from you. What does Friday mean to you?
So before I was in the service, Friday was always like the end of the school week or like, the end of the work week. Well, I worked at like a convenience store before I joined the Navy, so I had weird hours. But like, you'd see it as like, yeah, it's the end of the week. I got the weekend now. And in adult life, that's kind of different. Like, it changes a little bit, but that concept of the week is over and what have I accomplished? What did I do this week to improve myself, to help someone else? Like today I can say, well, I did this podcast with Matthew today, and I got to talk to an audience that, even though they've never met me, they might watch this video and be like, I learned something from this old guy today. I mean, that's like you said, it's to take that chance to do something.
No, I love that because it's like new beginnings.
Yeah. And reflection.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
being able to be like, I did this week. And sometimes, like, especially for people going through a really hard time in life, maybe the best thing they could focus on their Friday is that they made it through it.
That's a good takeaway. And Anthony, this is your part. This is your chance to leave the listeners with something powerful. Is there anything else you want to share?
Hard to say. I know this will probably be uploaded, long after Memorial Day is passed. It was this week, though, at the time of this recording. And I just, I want to say, please, remember the fallen and remember those who will lay their life down for others. And I think even Jesus said the best thing a man can do for another is to lay his life down for his friends.
That's a good quote.
Yeah, let me see if I can find that really quick.
Yeah, a
I don't
quote.
want to. I
A
don't want to
quote.
misquote the
No,
Bible.
the quote I use is, "What you are is God's gift to you, and what you do with it is your gift to God."
Hmm.
And that's powerful in its own way because you're so skilled and powerful in so many different ways. I know everyone's dealt a different hand at birth, but use the skills and acquire skills throughout your journey. And you only get so many summers in a lifetime.
Yeah.
And
So yeah,
go for it.
the verse is John 15:13, and it's the greater love has no one other than this, that one laid down his life for his friends.
And with that being said, Anthony, all your information will be in the description down below, but I want to make sure that people know where to find you. Where can the people follow and support your work?
So right now, I got a Facebook page which shows up as Anthony Joseph Jiovani, and I'll link this after you've published it to that. I did for the first one as well. Um, I've got a LinkedIn that I'm pretty sure uses my exact same name. Uh, I've been debating starting a YouTube channel to talk history and like the Bible and also literature. I'm a big fan of classical literature, but I haven't quite figured out all the mechanics of that. But hey, if that's something people would want to hear from me, let me know. Leave comments in the video or on YouTube or other things, and be like, yeah, we want to hear this, and tell me the kind of stories that you want to hear. You know, yeah,
I would love to see you take action towards a YouTube channel. That would be wonderful. I mean, I tell people all the time the best thing to do is just press record and
yeah.
start. Take action.
Well, if you had told me 20 years ago that we'd be doing these podcasts together, I'd probably be like, no way, man. I'm nervous. I can barely talk in front of people. But life, especially the military, has ways of changing you.
And I think you can change a lot of people. I mean, for me, I influence a lot of people nowadays on this channel, and it's really impactful in my life that I get to influence someone's life.
Uh-huh.
And I'm gonna challenge you to take that action.
Thank you. I appreciate the challenge.
And I appreciate you sharing your stories and experiences, and I appreciate you being on the show, Anthony.
Thank you, and thank you for allowing me to try out the PowerPoint. Like I said, it wasn't the most polished one I've ever done. Kind of just threw it together last minute, but I wanted to. People like to see visual aspects too, and that's why I was like, okay, I can throw some pictures in here and that. So, but yeah, and I really appreciate you for inviting me to be a part of this again.
No, I appreciate you being on the podcast. We have to do this again another time,
Oh yeah.
and I love the PowerPoint aspect of it. That was genius on your behalf, and I appreciate you being on the show. And to everyone listening, stay tuned for more amazing stories on Every Day is Friday 365. If you enjoyed this, make sure to follow, share, and keep that Every Day is Friday mindset going. Stay inspired and make every day feel like Friday. Until next time.